Hello and welcome. I'm Dan Batista, the Executive Director of the Institute for Citizen-Centered Service, or simply known as Citizen First. Thank you for joining us today for our special webinar with our guest speaker, James Stewart from Public Digital. In a moment, I'm going to ask Natasha Clark, the President of the ICCS, to formally introduce and welcome James to today's webinar. A couple things to cover off with regard to today's webinar. We are going to be recording this session. In fact, we are as I speak. And it will be available on our YouTube channel, Citizen First, in the next few days. Also, I just want to remind everyone, we are running this as a live event. And because of that, obviously, there is no audio, but we encourage you to submit your questions by way of the Q&A function up top. We will certainly endeavor to have James answer as many of your questions as possible following his presentation. And finally, I encourage you all to visit our website, citizenfirst.ca, for more information about the ICCS and upcoming events. Also, we'd greatly appreciate if you don't already to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our president, Natasha Clark, to get today's session started.
Thanks, Dan. And hello, everyone. I'm Natasha Clark. I'm the president of the Institute for Citizen-Centered Service. It's my pleasure to introduce this webinar on fixing digital funding in government from our friend James Stewart from Public Digital, all the way from England. He is a non-executive director in the UK Parliament, advises several startups, a member of the Mayor of Hackney's Digital Advisory Council, speaks regularly at events around the world, and the author of Budgeting for Change. Today, James will share examples of changes that government have made to meet that challenge and 7 shifts in culture, attitude, and behavior that are crucial for sustained digital success. I'm looking forward to hearing all about this. This is a topic that personally I'm very, very interested in, as I'm sure you are. Thank you for joining us in this first guest speaker event for 2022. Over to you, James.
Thanks, Natasha. Really great to be back. Are my slides coming up? Dan. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I think this is the 3rd time I've been at one of your events. About 18 months ago, talked about some of the lessons coming. What we thought was quite a long way through the pandemic. Turned out we had a lot further to go, probably still do. And then more recently with my colleague Anna talking about some of our work on open source. But for those who haven't met Public Digital before, we're a digital transformation consultancy headquartered in London, but working globally. Our origins are that a number of us who set up Public Digital founded the UK's government digital service back in 2011, best known for gov.uk, which is the single domain for UK government services and information, which spearheaded major transformation across the UK government. And we've taken the lessons from that and from a number of other experiences we've had, and then grown the team globally and across a number of sectors. So we work primarily in the public sector at the moment, but also have a number of large private sector clients, usually organisations that have some of the same challenges as governments, years of history, accumulated technology, but more importantly, kind of accumulated ways of doing things that mean that they're not as nimble as they might feel they need to be in the modern age. Our mission is to bring some of the world's biggest institutions into the internet era and improve millions of people's lives. And that institutions is the core focus. So organizations that, whether they're public or private sector, have a big role to play in the functioning of society around the world. So it's some of these, everybody from big financial services organizations that provide essential infrastructure through a number of governments, and quite a few multilaterals these days, people like the UNDP, who are providing really important services right around the world, supporting governments. And when we talk about digital, you may well have all seen this many times, but the definition that we use is that it's applying the culture, processes, operating models, and technologies of the internet era. Most importantly, to respond to people's raised expectations. It's not about technology for its own sake. In fact, often it's not even about technology at all. It's about taking the things that we've all learned over the last few decades about how we can work together and how we can harness all the different ways we have of communicating and cooperating to provide substantially better services for people. Today, I'm going to focus in on finance and funding. We were talking just before this started on how this is a really important topic, because so much of what we do is bounded by the financial decision making that we have, whether that's it as a reflection of where our priorities are, whether it's about an obstacle to getting something started, whether it's about something that can be a challenge in changing course, or whether it's hopefully something more positive and the thing that helps us bring in the teams that we need. Thesis is that it is the way that we make financial decisions, particularly in governments, I see this a lot in any large organisation, isn't equipped to help us take advantage of what we can do in the modern era, and that there are some big shifts that we need to make to change that. But to provide a little bit of broader context, when we were working in UK government, we spent quite a bit of time trying to understand what the big blockers to making digital progress were. And there were some which were fairly obvious. There weren't really modern digital skills on display. And things like very early on, we knew that the procurement systems that we had to use weren't set up to let us move quickly, experiment with new suppliers, do things in a different way, and adopt the cloud tools that were becoming more available. But we also spotted challenges around people's lives. I just got that echo that Natasha was getting. Turn it off. A lot of the challenges around how we did cybersecurity would slow things down as people came out of the woodwork towards the end of a big project or program of work and said, you can't do that, it's not safe. We found that the lack of an environment where people could really deliver the tools, the freedom with working spaces, the ability to cut across existing functions and bring together teams was a real problem. But most fundamental of all of those was the financial decision-making process. The way that the UK government makes decisions about finance, which is generally common to most governments and large organisations, is that it will privilege capital expenditure over operational expenditure. It's much more comfortable buying something big or investing in a large lump of infrastructure like a bridge, a road, than it is subscribing to an online service that will let some people be productive or provide a simple service. It builds a business case that demands a lot of false certainty, predicting the future when we can't possibly know quite how things will play out. And it just exists with an assumption that the way to do things is to privilege planning. And that was sort of really connected with the more traditional product and policy development that I and a lot of my colleagues have talked about quite a bit, where we organised ourselves around doing sort of some policy formation up front, spent a lot of time, a lot of money capturing requirements and doing large scale procurements. A comparatively small amount of time building services, launching them with some modicum of user acceptance testing, enough to check some boxes, but no real feedback from users, and only realizing at the end whether or not we were doing something that met user needs or frankly met any of the other outcomes that government was trying to achieve. When we talk about this, we usually focus on user needs. That's the core of what we do and what we believe in. But similarly, these processes meant that you didn't really know until the end if you were going to get the efficiency gains that you wanted, if you were going to effectively reduce the risk by removing some old ways of working and old systems. None of that could be known until the end, even if we pretended we could predict it at the start. But that process meant that we were incredibly limited in what could be done around service design. And designing good services starts with the identifying user needs. Talked about that a lot. If you don't know what those needs are, you won't build the right thing. But unless you can get some funding to get out and do that, you're stuck. Unless you can get your funding structured in a way that lets you iterate wildly based on what you learn from putting things in front of users, you're going to continue the pattern of building large systems without knowing if they're going to work. From a kind of policy structure, from a software development point of view, we introduced this model, which put user needs first, took people through a discovery process where they validated some of those user needs, checked if the assumptions they had about what people needed were right, into an alpha process where they prototype ways of meeting those needs, beta where you start to think about how to scale it up, and live where you iterate it with real users and keep improving it. There's pretty good evidence that shifting to that way of working leads to far better outcomes and far fewer large program failures. The Standish group did some research in 2015 where they looked at comparison of things that had followed a sort of previous waterfall, big design upfront process versus things that were managed in a more agile way, and saw about 1/3 fewer failures with agile projects than waterfall projects. Little wonder that people would focus on trying to shift to this agile way of working when you could do that without some other reforms around finance, but it's still an uphill struggle. And it becomes even more of a problem when you start thinking about how to share capabilities across parts of an organization, across parts of government, because the financial processes were structured around building things in a silo in one place, not creating teams that could adapt as they go on, find other people who might need what they've got, and get the funding they need to scale up or adapt how they're working to support people. So you bring in teams like these are teams around the world that we've worked with who are enthusiastic and focused and building great products and services, but who are still limited in what they can do because they're working within the parameters of the funding available to them. So as we went on with the UK story, we realized that the only way to move on was to start fixing some of those systemic blockers to delivery. We managed to do a lot of work on procurement. We brought in new, much more flexible procurement frameworks and built an environment where procurement specialists worked with digital specialists to bring in the new vendors and so on that we needed. We started to reform the cybersecurity approach, moving to something much more principles-based and where security design happened at the start of work rather than at the end, so that teams could really think seriously about security and not get caught out by it in the end. And started to create spaces where digital teams could work more effectively. We started to tackle finance, and we did create a more agile funding environment where it was in theory possible to get money for discoveries and alphas without going through the full treasury process. But we were pretty limited in how far we could get. And that was in large part because digital and finance were just operating in entirely different worlds. So the funding models and the world that the funding community was sitting in was so rooted in this sort of waterfall process. And that stems back to some of the deep management thinking of the 20th century, which from Taylor onwards had this assumption that the way to improve things was to put all of the emphasis on planning, that you could have separate groups of people who planned work versus delivered work, and that if you got the planning right, then the units who were implementing would just get it done and get it right. Now that was never ever true. Most of the management thinking driving that planning bias is flawed in all sorts of ways and based on bad research. But it's ever less true as we get into a more digital world, where so much of the value we can get is based on being able to do rapid work and get rapid feedback. And we're operating in a rapidly changing environment where people's expectations shift. We need to deal with pandemics, other unexpected circumstances that mean that the longer our planning cycle, the less chance we have of success. But those biases around planning are so deep-seated that most of the finance profession has had a real challenge moving away from it. And to be honest, the digital folks haven't done a great job always of explaining why we might not. And the previous ways of doing things have really supported a lot of political bias. So from a politician's point of view, you want announcements, and a big announcement of a large sum of money is always going to grab attention and sound like you're taking something seriously. Sadly, that also creates unrealistic expectations. So that can tie the hands of teams. It means that you're immediately into the world of trying to find those large amounts of money, go through a process, because it's all very well and good for a minister to say we're going to spend a lot of money. You still have to go through the government machine usually to get it. And any deviation from what's expected of that money becomes extremely hard, because it's big numbers, big announcements, a lot of attention that comes with it, and a lot of risk. For a long time, technology, particularly, and digital has just become lumped in with technology, has been treated as an overhead rather than a strategic investment. It's a cost center, something to be managed down. If you look in a lot of particularly corporate environments, the technology leaders, chief information officers, and so on, report to the chief financial officers, and that shows that it's seen as something to be managed down and cost controlled, rather than a fundamental part of how we deliver. And so that leads to several issues. One is that it can be very hard to justify radical new spending, but it also means that anytime you are getting some money and spending it on new, you're expected to spend that quickly and use it to reduce costs over time, and to look at that in the context purely of what's your technology budget, and not think about how can we spend more flexibly on some digital services in a way that makes government's action as a whole more effective or more efficient. And with that, the funding is often siloed and generally very risk averse. Once you've put in place a process that requires significant planning, significant upfront efforts, when you spent 2 years writing a business case, you're not going to want to change what you're doing. You're not going to want to do some experimentation. You want to follow through on that. There's a financial sunk cost in where you've got to, and also an emotional sunk cost. We've spent all this time, we've committed to these plans, we're going to do it. And usually a set of structures that also assume that the pre-existing organizational structure is the right one. And so if you find some opportunity that works across organizational boundaries, this all just gets so much more complex. Interestingly, these challenges are definitely not unique to the digital world. And as I was preparing for this, I found this paper by the Institution of Civil Engineers, and that really grabbed my attention, because so much of the time when we talk about the planning processes and the funding processes in governments, we'll use phrases like, well, that's all well and good for a bridge. Well, that's designed around building a battleship. It works for engineering. But organisations like the British Institution of Civil Engineers are looking at what in the UK is called the Treasury Green Book process. That's the set of rules for how you manage government business cases, and are saying it's no longer fit for how we should think about infrastructure from a civil engineering point of view, because it doesn't allow for system-wide thinking. It doesn't let you think about the interconnected network of parts of our physical infrastructure. And if you're spotting that in physical infrastructure, well, the far more fluid, interconnected, faster moving world of digital is just more the case. So this is not purely a digital issue, but digital sees it first because of the nature of what we're doing. So that's a sort of really quick skim through the way that funding processes are generally tied to waterfall thinking, tied to a lot of upfront planning, are not nimble enough to respond to the opportunities we have with digital. On reflection, having been through some experiences with that when I was in UK government and seen others going through it, the other thing that we spotted is that there can be new challenges that arise because of the way that digital units are often set up. So some of you will have come across the Defense Digital Service in the US. This is a picture of Chris Lynch, who founded it. They styled themselves as the Rebel Alliance, and it was a fantastic branding initiative. This is not a criticism of Chris or the Defense Digital Service. But in order to make progress as new digital units in governments around the world, a lot of us have had to style ourselves as insurgents. We're here to disrupt, we're here to do things differently. That's let us recruit people in who might not have thought about coming to work in government. It's given us some political support and some momentum to operate outside of the usual rules. And we could not have got where we've got in so many places unless these teams had operated that way. But when you start talking to people in finance ministries particularly, but with a lot of established governance roles across governments, they will say that the assumption that starts to build with that is that we don't care about governance at all. And I mean, that's not true, but it's a perception challenge that needs to be picked apart. So this is something that Public Digital has been thinking about quite a lot. We published some things with Harvard Kennedy School, with David Eves there, particularly focused on some of the finance challenges that particularly come to the fore if you're working with large multilateral donors who are giving money to either their own projects or to governments in various parts of the world to support things, but very much have a structure that's based around we will give you some infrastructure, we'll give you some capital spending, we'll give you an app, starting to recognise that perhaps teams are what's needed more than apps, but need to reform some processes. But then we did a deeper piece of work, a longer piece of work in collaboration with the Boston Consulting Group, which is the paper that led to this session, which we titled Fixing Digital Funding in Government. And in that, we looked at two case studies, one of the work that we've done in the UK and one of the new digital investment fund that's been set up in New South Wales, and found 7 shifts that we felt were needed in order to start changing the culture around how funding works in governments and how finance does. These are the 7: funding less but more often, more achievements, fewer intentions, regular budget reviews, fund teams, embed different governance practices, encouraging different practices, and embracing a little OPEX over a lot of CapEx. Could talk a lot about all of those. You're far better off going and reading the paper if you want to get into all of them. I thought for now, to give us time for questions, I'd just pick out 3 areas of those I think are worth a little bit more time. So the first of those is kind of the core of where most people's thinking about how to fund digital sits, which is that digital services work best when they are organised around persistent mission-driven teams. That's teams who have a clear mission, but a lot of space to experiment, try different approaches to meet it. are encouraged to explore different ways of meeting the needs that they're responsible for, which change shape over time, but which have a core that persists well beyond any kind of program funding, which is the usual mode in large organizations, where we'll say, you have 3 years to stand up some teams, we'll probably fill them with contractors, and then they'll go away. And if you're lucky, you'll get some maintenance time. This is it. Funding persistent mission-driven teams is an easy thing to say, a much harder thing to do. But it's something that anybody who's running a program can start thinking about and start grappling with, as you start to even just changing the language and saying, what we're doing is we're using this money to stand up a team and start running a service. We're not running a traditional program. We're building the service will run on. And so we're getting a sense of what it costs to run it for real, not just what does it cost to stand it up in the first place, with no sense of sort of what we might call business as usual. New South Wales is a really good example of starting to think about that, as they've brought in their Digital Restart Fund, which is really focused on funding multi-year efforts, but with persistent teams that deliver end-to-end customer journeys. There's more information about that in the report. You can go and explore it. Obviously, they can't give a promise of persistent funding forever, but they're probably the leaders in starting to say, our job here is to fund teams, and we will then expect that those teams continue. Next one, I've sort of combined two of the shifts from paper, funding less but more often, embedding modern governance practices. So even within the constructs of current government finance, it's often within the gift of people who are running programs to take the money they're allocated and think differently about how they release it. It requires an attention to detail from leadership to do this, but you can stand up and say, we're not going to start with 12 teams running in parallel. We're going to start with one. We're going to release a bit more money when we've seen if our user needs are validated, when we've seen that the team needs to do something more. Not being embarrassed to give money back if it turns out you asked for too much, or to go and be open about the fact that there's some money left and that there are new opportunities to meet. You can also start to really amplify more of the fact that digital teams care about governance. So we did some of this in the UK, but I think it was sometimes lost in the perception of us as the insurgents, and I think that's happened in other places, but starting to be really clear about standards and inviting finance colleagues and others to the table, sort of showing that the digital governance, which is continuous, that is about those teams and is about incremental release of funding, can give better insight into whether things are working over time. And that has application more broadly. So we did some work with California, where they were able to introduce their digital crisis standard. I think I talked about this for ICCS 18 months ago, but showing that they had a really clear governance structure around what they would put on their COVID response website was a really good way of also signaling that they were serious about governance overall. And lots of other jurisdictions and governments are building their digital service standards. What would be good is to see a lot more in this sort of work about financial governance at the same time, to really state intent. And then finally, because I'm keen to get to your questions, there's a big political dimension to a lot of this. Fundamentally, to change something as important to governments as their financial governance processes, you need political involvement. In the UK, as in most countries, there's a history of different administrations using the financial processes in different ways. So the Labour government of the late 90s, early 2000s really prioritised big infrastructure investment programmes. The coalition government in the early 2010s was very much around sort of detailed scrutiny and looking at lots of options for spending. These processes are malleable, but a lot of that stems from political personalities and the drive of that. There hasn't been enough shift towards saying, let's do some systemic reform. And to do that, you need some political buy-in. There's no magic answer to that, but there are a few things that we can start to trail and to lead. Some of that is about the fact that the previous funding mechanisms leads to a large amount of failure, but it's good to have a more positive story. So focusing public attention on sort of actual deliveries and functionality, just doing that more and more. This is why working in the open is so important. Starts to change a culture and build trust through delivery. Being open about learning can be really hard, but also starts to build that shift, and you can build political capital if you get that right. An example from the UK is a thing called universal credits, which is the biggest benefits reform programme in a generation. There'd been a version of that where hundreds of millions of pounds had been spent with traditional suppliers. It had not gone well. There was a lot of parliamentary scrutiny of how it was going wrong. A new team came in to approach it in a very different way. And rather than trying to do some kind of root and branch reform of it, rather than trying to follow the big announcement and counter the negative publicity with sort of positive spin, they started small. They focused in on areas. So this is one area served by one job centre in the UK where they tested the new universal credit system that they were developing with a whole range of users, iterated it very fast. And where the previous system only had lost money to talk about, they at least had this one postcode area of success to talk about, which meant that not only did they learn and were able to reprioritize what they were doing and scale up from there, but they had a good news story that was real, that was tangible, and it wasn't just the team or the politicians telling that story. Local people, civil servants on the front line working with those local people could tell the story too. And being able to do that was part of how they then built permission to continue in the way that they were going. Universal credit is still in a position where it's a big government program. It doesn't necessarily have the long enduring funding that it might want, but it's kind of continuing, and it's shown a very different way. When it comes to shifting the political conversation, examples like this, examples of where you've got significantly more success from one small thing than from a huge announcement, is a really important part of the toolbox. So that's a really rapid run through some things. This is an area which is fundamentally important, not just for digital teams, but actually for building governments that are much more responsive to changing environments and changing user needs. And it's one that's not talked about nearly enough. I very much hope that at some point before long, we can come back and do this again with a lot more case studies of experiments people are doing in changing funding environment. So far, they're few and far between. But hopefully by getting out and talking about it, by having sessions like this, we can start to unlock a bit more experimentation. So that is my prepared section. Look forward to hearing where you want to take it. Thank you.
James, that was awesome and spectacular, and I have now managed to figure out how to use technology. So that's amazing. So I know we're waiting. We're gathering folks' questions, and please don't be shy. This is really. James and I were talking before the webinar started. As somebody who's been on a journey here in Nova Scotia for digital government for some time, this is the kind of secret challenge, the secret part of transformation that nobody really talks about openly. We talk a lot about user needs and service design and things like that, but funding models and the way we fund our work and think about supporting our work is actually really that underpinning piece of transformation. And so on that, I do have one question. I think I'm channeling my colleague Hillary in Ontario about James, from your perspective, if this is a new place for us in terms of even the thinking, what would be your top 1, 2, or 3 things in terms of how do we just start?
Yeah. So I think the advantage there is that a lot of people have already started, in the sense that you have teams who are delivering valuable services. Because so often when you look at the problem from outside, you say, well, if there's a 2-year funding approval process, how can we possibly start anything? But once you've got a team and they're delivering some things, you're making a case from a very different position. I think part of it is the being more deliberate in talking about not just what teams are delivering, but how digital leaders are governing that work. I think that's the thing we probably don't talk about enough. So things like, say, it's the service standards that we've all got. They're really good at talking about those things. You mentioned the sort of the user needs and the service design. The fact that they're, when used properly, they are things that give teams really good direction on what good looks like, and give leaders really good tools for understanding. I can kind of see the spending that's going on, and I can see, am I getting quality delivery happening at the same time? That's where they're really powerful. But we don't really talk about that. So I think there's something about just getting out and talking about the fact that we're not throwing out governance. We're doing it differently, and probably in a way that gives a lot more insight. Because I continue to run into a lot of people who just don't want to start the conversation because they assume that all these digital teams, they just want all the money and they want the freedom to do everything. Not actually, we all really care about doing this stuff well and within the right parameters. After that, I think that there's the things that helped us in the UK, and that I think have helped other people, is that there are people in finance ministries and other places who also recognise that something needs to change, but we've often not managed to make those connections, and that's I think one of the next things that needs to happen. So I'd love to see more people who've come up through digital units transferring to work in their treasury or finance ministry as their next position, and vice versa.
I think that's actually a brilliant idea, and I'm definitely stealing it because, spreading out that experience throughout the system is how we'll make change. So thanks for that, James. I have another question that our audience has proposed. So wondering if and how you use digital experience monitoring or benchmarking to support funding details in a business case, or to make the case for funding.
So I don't know of anybody who really built that deep into business cases in quite that way. One thing that worked for us in the UK was a thing we had called the performance platform, which was it was at gov.uk/performance, and it started as a list of all of the government services that we could find. And, it was one of those delightful things. We found 600 and something, and as soon as we published that, people sent us details of another 100, and it kept growing. But measuring those against 4 key performance indicators, kind of successful completion rate, digital take-up, a couple of others, and using those, you could very clearly show, cost per transaction was another big one, very relevant here. Using those, you could very quickly get some evidence that would say, okay, this particular service is disproportionately expensive. You couldn't just say that's the most expensive service in government, therefore bad, because some things are expensive to run, but you could say this one's quite like this other one. and yet it's 10 times the price. So that sort of evidence where, and that tying cost and successful completion rates closely together was really important within that, because failed completion is often one of the biggest sources of cost. So seeing that work not really as a sort of fundamental part of the business case, but focusing attention on which services should we write business cases for, that worked. And not many others have done that kind of rigorous benchmarking kind of thing that we did there, but a lot of people have used similar kind of techniques of saying, what are our most expensive services? Which ones do people complain about the most? And then the next thing that we did, which was more around the service standard assessments, and so sometimes affected whether you got follow-on funding, was to ask about user research techniques, which was the mix of qualitative and quantitative. So if a team said, oh, we don't have any analytics, they probably wouldn't get very far. Yeah.
Awesome, James. Our next question that I see posted, I'd be interested in hearing more about your flexible framework for procurement. It's a challenge. I feel like that one's probably been bolded and underscored from our participant. Happy to see documents or if there's no time to answer the question. And I know that there are lots of examples out there, but just interested obviously to hear a bit more about flexible frameworks for procurement, James.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's potentially whole other sessions, and have other colleagues who are kind of more expert on the kind of procurement profession end of this. But before we started GDS in the UK, there was already a movement to say we needed a different procurement framework for cloud services, and it became known as G Cloud. It was an idea that rather than, if you need a cloud-based productivity tool, you shouldn't go through a big tender process because nobody who offers them will want to participate in that. Instead, we should recognize these things as commodities, and we should have a simple marketplace where you can search for them, compare them on the right characteristics, and then pick the cheapest one. So a framework was put in place for that called G Cloud, presented through an online marketplace. And it was pretty successful. It had software as a service options, it had infrastructure as a service options, and it meant that you could, rather than go out for tender, get the people who wanted to sell to government. You could get some people who could see the advantage of being on a framework but not responding to every tender. The other thing we did was a parallel framework called Digital Outcomes and Specialists, and that was for buying teams. And it was quite important, that split between commodity products and teams. And with that one, again, you could do a lot online. There was a very simple process, digitalmarketplace.service.gov.uk. You'd publish a description of an outcome you'd wanted. Suppliers would answer a few very simple questions. You'd already have information about their rate card. And it still sounds like quite a traditional procurement, and it was all legally compliant, but just by taking some of the friction out of the process and making it more of an online experience, you were able to take out that sunk cost thing. It's by making it quick, you make people feel much more comfortable with buying smaller lots. Because, if that goes wrong, we can do it again fairly quickly. We've not expended much effort on it. All of which was also underpinned by bringing more digital specialists in-house in government, so that the people doing that evaluation were people who know what good looks like. So loads more that we could talk about like how to make sure it's legal and how to present it and how they really took the friction out. But hopefully that gives a taste of it. And there's a lot of stuff out online about what we did.
Awesome. Well, that sounds like a future webinar and discussion that I look forward to sharing, is to learn more about that. I see another question that our colleagues have asked us. Changing the funding model needs to start from convincing the Central Treasury Board. What are actions that we, as just a ministry team trying to work digitally, do to influence this change?
So I think the fundamental change needs to involve treasury boards and finance ministries, whoever they are in each government. I think some of what I talked about the just modeling different behaviors is something that can happen more locally. So I don't know the ins and outs of your funding arrangements, but with the way that UK funding works, a bold leader who's willing to really focus on the details of it actually has quite a lot of discretion once they've got the money to shape the governance around how that money's spent. And so by doing that, they can start to build up some evidence that there are better ways of governing how you spend money. Still have to make the case for it was probably quite painful to get to that point, and it shouldn't be. But at least you can start to say, well, one of the things I sometimes talk about is it often feels like in most large organizations, we do a lot more governing the business case process than we do governing the delivery. And you can start to change that just by doing different governance around the delivery and use that to make the case for why what you're doing is trustworthy, to show that small amounts of money can be used in creative ways. You can start to do that within ministry contexts. And I know in some places they've started to look at that as also a portfolio within a particular ministry. So you start with the digital team doing things in a different way, and then you say the CFO of that ministry starts to mirror it. And that's still quite early in most places that I've seen them trying it. That feels like a really powerful route, because if you can get to the point where it's the CFO advocating for the change, not the chief digital officer, you're probably onto something good.
So find your champions early and think about them strategically, right? In terms of those partners that maybe will be skeptical to maybe join your multidisciplinary team to work in different ways. But I've certainly seen that when you've been able to show a difference, folks can sit in other rooms and champion things that does feel differently than the CDO talking about it, kind of thing. So that's awesome. I noticed we have another question. There's lots of questions coming, James, which I'm not surprised to see. Any suggestions or examples on approaches in the interim before a new funding model in place? So how to use already approved capital funding in a different way to support moving down this road, as an example?
Yeah, I mean, so barely touched on the capital versus operational things, which again is a whole host of issues. I think that there's a complicated set of questions about what you can reasonably use capital money for and what you can capitalize. There's also probably a lot of quite helpful ambiguity in that. So there's something that comes in thinking about how can you start to talk about your capitalizing some of the things that you're producing that you might not have expected to. So bits of intellectual property, perhaps, or it's a fuzzy thing of how you use capital funding. I know people do things like work out complex arrangements where they can capitalize their cloud spending. I think that's generally a bad idea. I think this is one where it is quite difficult to get into what your options are without knowing your context, though, because say in the UK, nobody can actually tell me where a rule comes from that says that you're allowed to move OPEX to CapEx, but not the other way around. But the Treasury thinks it exists. So I don't know, this is a bit all over the place. I suppose the one area where I think it might be easiest is if you start looking at what you're doing with some of your legacy tech, because one of the issues people have with some of that is an unwillingness to write down assets that are no longer assets. If you've got some capital spending available, perhaps you can use it to do some of that, which then unblocks other ways of doing things.
Well, I think that really speaks to the complexity of the issue, James, and having to kind of bounce around, and how we are kind of faced with that challenge of CapEx and OpEx. And I think, again, that probably warrants a whole other discussion for another day. But I do think looking creatively at our funding that we currently have as an organization in our organizations, and how might we, again, leverage that investment differently to help us advance this agenda. Speaking of different approaches, I see our next question. How can private sector partners help government with digital transformation initiatives? Many digital initiatives seem to not want to leverage external expertise in helping governments transform service delivery. So that's a really interesting question. James, I'll hand it over to you.
Very, very broad as well. So I think there's definitely been a tension as governments have built up their digital teams, often with particularly the incumbent private sector suppliers. So one of the huge success stories for the UK, and this is again being replicated in lots of places, is that there was a new wave of suppliers who started to work with government. We could never have hired the capacity that we needed, and we had to have a mix of suppliers in. And we never should have hired everything we needed, because there was some moment in time skills. We just needed that specialism for a short while. What worked was where suppliers were committed to helping us increase our control. And I think that that's a really important part of it. The nature of the relationships between particularly IT suppliers and governments and large corporates for quite a long time has been one where it's sort of seen as a bit of a zero-sum game, where either government wins by getting low prices, or the suppliers win because they've been able to suck all of the expertise out of government and therefore charge high prices because nobody knew how much things should cost. I think there is a shift where people are saying, okay, actually, digital and technology are so fundamental to success in so many places that this doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We can all benefit here. That governments need strategic control of the services they're offering and the technology that underpins them. They need support in doing that. And I've started to see suppliers who are doing a lot more work around building training into how they work with people in government. So they will actually come in and they'll say, we'll bring you a multidisciplinary digital team. We'll also bring you some academy sort of resources around that, so that the people you put in that team go away able to run the service without us, which is bold from the supplier, because they're giving up the possibility to own and run that thing for a long time. But actually it builds a lot of trust and opens up some new opportunities. That's sort of looking at how can the private sector build capacity in government is really important. It's then, incumbent on governments to really think smartly about what amount of control do we need, and how can we make sure that we're offering good growth opportunities to the suppliers that do work in these ways we want them to do. For a number of places, that has been about changing procurement so that it's easier for suppliers to bid for the right work and to know what's going on. It can be about finding better ways to share the successes. So working openly, it's, one of our refrains, but a lot of bits of government don't like their suppliers to talk about what the suppliers have done. I think if government is confident that it's got the relationship right, it should allow that, and that lets them branch out. And there are definitely examples from the UK of companies that came and worked with us. They were quite early. Some of them have since gone public and have moved out to work in other countries, and they've really grown a lot from that. and that's a huge success story for us.
I absolutely think there's, again, speaking of another webinar, a whole discussion about how our procurement and funding model changes can actually help drive the digital economy, in your jurisdiction. I think, is one that will be, an interesting one to follow up on. I'm multitasking. I'm trying to figure out what our next question is and then also have a conversation. So I think
former colleague Warren Smith did a lot of work with the OECD around exactly that, and taking digital marketplace approaches and seeing them as a sort of driver of economic growth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm a big believer that there is a large ecosystem for all players to play in. It's not about one player having the entire ecosystem to themselves. So I think that will be important. I think we have time for maybe one last question. So you spoke earlier about breaking projects into smaller increments and moving progressively to the desired outcomes. How were these increments designed, developed, and how was financing leveraged to ensure positive value-based progress? And when things went off direction from the desired outcomes, what undertakings got it back on track? That's a very lengthy question for our last one, so maybe a few final thoughts that might tie back to the question.
Yeah, so the core bit, I think, and there's lots written about that discovery alpha beta live process, was to say, firstly, get a really deep understanding of the policy outcomes you're trying to meet and the user needs that you're trying to serve, and see how they fit together. And the teams that did best with those discovery pieces would often say, we can't meet all of those outcomes in one go. But what we can do is we can find part of it that we can move quickly on. And so it wasn't so much sort of breaking one big thing into increments. It was more picking a good place to start and iterating from there. And so iterating includes shifting direction at times, whereas increments sort of implies you're just doing it step by step. So that building an ability to start small, iterate out, and be open about the fact that you might have to do some other things to meet some of the other outcomes. Yeah, lots more to say, but we're short on time.
Exactly. Thank you, James. Thank you for all of your great comments and the discussion today. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to hand things back over to Dan Batista to wrap things up today.
My apologies, folks. Mute. Thank you, Natasha and James. I want to thank especially our guest, James, for taking time out, and certainly the time difference. Always, you think you can get everything in 60 minutes. You just can't. And you've given us some great thoughts with regard to potential webinars for sure. I want to thank everyone who attended today and the phenomenal questions. I think that obviously is a reflection, James, of what you presented today and the reflections. I'll just, on a personal note, because I was deliberately trying not to jump in on the questions, I think this is an area that has long needed attention, right? And today, what you raised and the significance of it is so essential, right, moving forward, because, and then Tasha and I were talking about this earlier, digital is always about, how do we deliver the best client-centric or citizen-centric services, right? And the funding kind of doesn't come into that conversation. It only does from the perspective of how you get it and the risk and mitigation and whatnot. But it's evident that, that we need to really start to unpack all of this. So I'm looking forward to future conversations and bringing you back. So thanks again, James, to you and certainly all your colleagues at Public Digital and the incredible work you do. And thank you to Natasha for taking time out of her busy day today to walk us through this fascinating session. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.